Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 41. Steve, Jarvis, Phil, and Bruce. Things had been insanely busy for the last week and a half, not to mention a little jarring. Worse, there was no hope of things calming down anytime soon. It would be weeks before the rebuilding efforts had gotten to the point where superpowered assistance wouldn't be almost required. And Steve wasn't fool enough to think that everything would be easy and roses once the rebuilding effort had gotten to that point either. Unfortunately, Steve knew they couldn't really afford to concentrate on the rebuilding for the entire time their help would be needed. Not when they had another army coming at them in an all too short length of time. They'd done well enough thrown together at the last minute like they had been, but if they'd had time to train together, it could and would have gone a lot better and smoother. They needed to train together. Unfortunately, Steve had no idea of where they could do that, or really of even how to do it. He knew battle tactics like the back of his hand, and would be able to deal with that end of things. He also had a vague idea of how to train regular soldiers, but that wasn't exactly going to be much help with the Avengers for multiple reasons. And while he'd figured out how to take advantage of his own abilities after the serum, that wouldn't really help the others, who didn't have the same abilities. First and foremost, the team had several heavy hitters that could do more damage than any gun or tank, and more than most bombs if they put their mind to it. One mistake or loss of control would do a lot of damage to the surroundings. Because of that, a training area near any kind of population was a bad idea, especially if Steve could manage to convince Bruce to let them try working with the Hulk. Steve thought about how to fix the problem for a minute, then grinned. "Jarvis, you got a minute?" he asked, glancing up at the ceiling of his apartment. He knew Jarvis had sensors other places, but he hadn't been able to quell the habit of addressing the ceiling. "Of course, Captain. How may I be of assistance?" Jarvis asked. "Are Phil and Bruce busy right now?" Steve asked. "I will inquire. One moment, please," Jarvis said. A few moments later, he spoke up again. "They are both available at the moment." "Okay, good. Would you ask them to come by my quarters? There's some stuff I want to talk to them about. And I'd like to include you in the talk too, Jarvis." Jarvis was surprised that Captain Rogers would include him in a discussion with Agent Coulson and Dr. Banner. Captain Rogers, like everyone else, remained unaware that Jarvis was a person in his own right. He supposed that Captain Rogers was following Sir's lead and treating Jarvis as if he was a person, regardless of whether he believed Jarvis was or not. He did come from an era where manners were more stringently observed, after all. Actually, now that Jarvis considered the matter, it was entirely possible that Captain Rogers thought Jarvis was a person. The 30s and 40s had been an era rife with predictions and speculations as to the technologies of the future, most of which had not yet come to pass. But Captain Rogers would have grown up on such speculation, and given his situation, might be taking it on faith that some of those speculations had actually been achieved. In this regard, living with Sir would only have encouraged that belief, as Sir was capable of creating technical marvels that no other could equal. Phil was very curious as to what Steve would want to talk to him about. He gave himself a mental slap and a scold to get it together when he noticed he was all but bouncing in eagerness. Well, not literally and physically anyway, thank goodness, but mentally. Even after nearly 2 weeks around the men, Phil had an unfortunate tendency to lose his cool when he had to deal with Steve. It was embarrassing, including Natasha, especially Clint. Took a great deal of pleasure in teasing him about his slip-ups. He was even more intrigued when he got off the elevator at Steve's floor and realized that Bruce was already there. What in the world could Steve want to discuss that involved both of them? Not much of their interests or capabilities intersected. There were really only two choices Phil could think of. The serum, or something to do with the team as a whole. Meaning Hulk 2. And Steve was hoping to confer with them as to logistics. More specifically, training. Team training was far more likely to be the subject of the discussion, and while Steve was aware of Phil's status as a fan, it did not immediately follow that he was interested in the serum itself. So talking to Phil about some aspect of the serum was unlikely. "Captain, Jarvis said you wanted to talk to me?" Phil asked. "Steve, please, Steve said, making a slight face. And I was wanting to talk to you both, and Jarvis too, since he's involved in all this through the Iron Man suit, about training as a team. Steve heaved a sigh. I have a vague idea of how to train soldiers, but my stint in basic was aggrabist, not exactly standard. So even if I was dealing with soldiers, it wouldn't be enough. And most of the participants in the initiative are not soldiers, Phil said with a nod, understanding the problem. Only 3 of their number, Steve, Phil, and Logan, had been soldiers. And Logan had little to no active memory of that training. Treating the group like a military unit would be an unmitigated disaster. Steve nodded. I know S.H.I.E.L.D. is sort of military, but you worked with Clint and Natasha a lot, Steve said. The corollary there being that Phil would at least have an idea of how to work with people who weren't soldiers and get them to work as a team. Unfortunately, Steve was somewhat in error. While Phil did work with them, he hadn't exactly had to work to get them working as a team. They'd meshed with no help from him at all. That said, Phil did know of some techniques that would work. He just hadn't had to use them with Clint and Natasha. I could certainly assist you with that, Phil said. We are fortunate in that everyone involved has at least a basic understanding of their individual capabilities, which will help immensely. We will merely have to get everyone used to working together and find the best matches for smaller groupings when such are required by circumstances. Not having to teach people how to fight from the ground up would help immensely, even if Phil would be ensuring that everyone took advantage of the skills their fellows possessed, and at least attempt to learn from them. While not everyone would be able to master every skill, it was entirely possible someone would discover a heretofore unsuspected knack for some skill or other. Steve nodded. Thanks, sir. Steve then turned to Bruce. And I wanted to talk to you about the feasibility of bringing Hulk into training. Bruce's immediate instinctive response to bringing the other guy out for any reason whatever was no. That was a response he forced himself to throttle, then actually think about it. The other guy had been willing to focus on the abomination that first time, something Bruce had assumed was a fluke or due to the fact that Betty was present and Hulk wished to protect the one human who was at all sympathetic to his existence at the time. But in the face of his cooperation during the invasion and Bruce's somewhat reluctant acceptance of the fact that there was more to the other guy than rage and destruction, he was no longer sure that was the case. We wouldn't be able to do it a lot, Bruce said. Transforming does a bit of a number on me. We'd also have to be somewhere a long way from innocent bystanders, Bruce finally said. I really can't tell you how the other guy would react to a training scenario. I don't even know that he'd understand. He could decide it was a legitimate fight, or just run off. Would having Betty there help? Steve wanted to know. Bruce instantly shook his head. No, her being right there would definitely incite the other guy to treat it like an actual attack. According to Betty, he's extremely protective of her. She said that her showing up in his sightline is what ended up turning the tide during the incident at Culver University. Evidently, Ross's sound wave tanks had actually been working until then. Bruce made a face. She showed up and he went into overdrive trying to protect her. Bruce was pretty sure there's a missing piece or two to the sequence of events there, but the point still stood. Even if the other guy managed to comprehend training as being different from fighting, Betty being anywhere near the tussle would throw a spanner into the works really fast. That said, having her close by enough to come help corral the other guy if he goes off script would be a good idea. Just not where he could see or hear her until she's needed. Bruce admits. He's fairly sure that Tony could keep the other guy in line, but the two of them are new enough to each other that there's a chance the other guy wouldn't respond to him. Comparatively, Bruce is pretty sure that Betty could pull the other guy out of even the most uncontrolled smash fit just by showing up. Steve nodded, obviously absorbing the information. Good to know. I want to at least try. From what I understand, no one's really attempted to actually work with him in any way. Just shoot at him. It doesn't really surprise Bruce all that much that Steve looks pissed about that. It does, however, still manage to throw his emotions into a twist because Steve was pissed on behalf of the other guy who, until recently, had only one supporter. Betty. He still didn't quite know what to make of the growing group of people who were willing to give the other guy a chance, especially when one of that bunch was himself. Might come to nothing, but then again, it might not. He at least deserves a chance, same as everybody else. And again, Bruce had to actively clamp down on the nearly instinctive urge to insist that Steve was dead wrong and that the other guy was an unthinking, dangerous monster. He didn't bother trying to stop the bubble of odd gratitude, though, even if the part of him that had been fighting the other guy for so long thought Steve and Tony were nuts for thinking the other guy was anything other than horrible. I would presume my portion of this discussion would be to inform you if Sir had any properties that would suit, Jarvis asked. He couldn't really see any other purpose for his inclusion. Partially, Steve agreed. I mean, you don't have to tell me where they are or anything, but knowing if we'd have to get a hold of a place that'd work before we could train would be a good idea. I was also kind of wondering, well, just how much we can do. Captain Rogers sounded uncertain. I am unclear on your meaning, Jarvis admitted. I mean, well, obviously you help run Tony's armor, but could you run an armor by yourself if you needed or wanted to? Captain Rogers asked. Jarvis understood, at least in part what information Steve was seeking. Sir ensured I would be able to take over a suit if it became necessary, yes. Could you help with Tony and run a second armor? Steve asked. Jarvis debated the wisdom of attending future battles on his own, or rather with his own suit to command, rather than only assisting with Sir's suit. The idea had both good points and bad. To the good was the fact that he was capable of it without any diminution in his processing speed overall, which meant there wouldn't be problems with lags in reaction time. He would also be another set of eyes and weapons for the team in dire situations. To the bad was the much increased likelihood of one of the Avengers realizing that Jarvis was much more than they had initially assumed him to be. They were all highly intelligent individuals, and they would not long remain under the incorrect assumptions they currently held as to his status as an independent being in those circumstances. Artificial intelligence had its limits, after all, or at least AI's not built by Sir did. True emotion and independence of thought and action remained beyond the average AI, which had long ceased to be a factor for Jarvis. Sooner or later, the Avengers were going to notice. So really, the question was whether or not Jarvis was willing to trust them with that information as quickly as they would obtain it while observing him act on his own reconnaissance during combat. And the answer to that was no, not yet. Trust had become a precious, viciously guarded commodity in the wake of Stane's betrayal, and while Jarvis was tentatively willing to trust these men and women in Sir's company, and to a certain extent with Sir's life, he did not trust them fully yet. No, Jarvis said. His deliberations had happened so quickly there was no hesitation between Captain Rogers' question and Jarvis's response. While my programming permits me to override the Iron Man armors, if Sir is injured or unconscious long enough to get him to safety, they do not permit me to run a suit independent of human attendance outside of such emergencies. Programming. More like Sir's permission. Sir had also given Jarvis blanket permission to lock Sir out of the armors if he was intoxicated, after that ill-conceived birthday party when Sir had been dying of palladium poisoning. Of course, Sir had cut down his drinking markedly after that incident. He still consumed alcohol, but with neither the quantity nor the frequency that had been the norm prior to Sir's brush with death. Fair enough, Captain Rogers said with a nod. Thanks for letting me know. As to the other matter, Sir has two properties that might suit for training purposes. I will inform him of your interest and see which he thinks would be best, or if he has another facility in mind. Sir often anticipates such things, Jarvis said, which was at least the honest truth. Sir was very likely to have realized the necessity of a training facility for the group at some point. Unfortunately, it was not always possible for Jarvis to figure out what Sir was up to, so he may have missed the significance of any traffic going to one facility or another, especially if Sir had merely earmarked it as construction equipment or the like. Thank you, Jarvis. I appreciate that, Captain Rogers said.